Maria Evans stepped into the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been in countless legal battles before, but this one felt different. Her hands were steady as she held the papers for her defense. But there was an unease in the air that she couldn't ignore. Judge Arthur Harris sat at the bench with a look of indifference on his face. The courtroom was quiet as he flipped through his notes with an air of finality, as if he had already made up his mind about the outcome. Maria had worked hard on this case, hoping that her arguments would be heard. But from the moment she entered the room, it felt like the judge wasn't even listening. The charge against her was minor, a technicality regarding her nonprofit's tax filings, but she knew it was just an excuse to make her pay for something much larger. Her work in social justice had gained attention in the community, and there were those who didn't like the changes she was advocating for, people who felt threatened by the progress she was making. Maria didn't back down. She knew that the fight was bigger than this one courtroom battle, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that this was personal. She stood tall as Judge Harris called the court to order. The judge's gaze met hers briefly, but it was cold as he spoke to her, with a certain dismissiveness that stung despite his calm tone. He made it clear that he wasn't interested in hearing her defense. He had already decided on the fine, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The words hit her like a blow. She felt the weight of them pressing against her chest, but she refused to let them show in her face. She had worked too hard to let a moment like this break her. She had spent years fighting for those who had no voice in the system, for people like her who had been overlooked and forgotten. Maria had been raised in a neighborhood where the law wasn't always on your side, where it seemed like the rules were made for everyone but people like her and her family. From an early age, she learned that the system was stacked against people who looked like her, and that the fight for justice was never easy, but it was a fight she was determined to win. As the judge's gavel came down, Maria's thoughts raced, but she stayed composed. The fine was significant enough to cause a setback for her organization, but she wasn't about to let it stop her. The courtroom cleared as people filed out, leaving her standing alone before the judge. She felt the weight of the moment, but she didn't flinch. She had known this would be hard, but she had never been afraid of hard work or of pushing back against a system that didn't always have her best interests at heart. Her mind was already on the next steps. She had plans for reform, ideas that could change the way people interacted with the justice system and the way the law saw them. She would keep moving forward, no matter what. The courtroom had been a battle, but it was just one small piece in the larger fight. She was determined to win for the people who needed her the most. As she walked out of the courtroom, the air felt different, a little heavier, but she was ready to take on whatever came next. She wouldn't be defeated by one unfair ruling. She was just getting started. The days following the court ruling felt like a whirlwind for Maria. As she moved through the motions of her everyday life, the fine was steep, but it was more than that. It was a reminder of how easily people could be dismissed when they didn't fit a certain mold. She had expected the resistance, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly her story would spread across the city. The media coverage was immediate. Social media exploded with outrage. People began to share her story, tagging her nonprofit and expressing their support for Maria Evans. She was no longer just the founder of a small nonprofit. She had become a symbol of resilience against the system that seemed intent on keeping people like her down. It wasn't long before she started receiving messages from people she had never met, people who had heard about the fine and felt compelled to reach out. Some offered donations to help cover the fine. Others promised to stand by her in future battles. Maria read each message carefully, taking note of the faces behind the words. She didn't take their support for granted, but she couldn't allow herself to get distracted by the growing attention. Either she had a job to do, and that job wasn't over just because of one courtroom setback. She was more determined than ever to continue her mission to reform the very system that had just tried to silence her. But now there was a new layer to the story, something that Maria hadn't expected to emerge from the media coverage. Maria's work and her nonprofit had always been focused on creating sustainable solutions for marginalized communities. But as the coverage grew, it became clear that Maria's approach to legal reform wasn't just about helping those affected by the system. It was about changing the system itself. And that was when the real interest began to build. Legal professionals began to take notice of her work. Academics reached out to her to discuss her innovative methods of preventing recidivism in the criminal justice system. Experts began to recognize the scope of her legal framework and how it could be used to reshape the way the system worked. It wasn't long before Maria's name was being mentioned in legal journals and at conferences as a thought leader in the field. While this attention was gratifying, it also made Maria nervous. She didn't want to be seen as just a symbol. She wanted to be taken seriously for the work she had done, not the fine that had been imposed on her. Despite the growing support, Maria felt the weight of the situation on her shoulders. Her nonprofit was still facing financial strain, and she needed to continue her work regardless of the public attention surrounding her. Maria kept her focus sharp, continuing to push forward with her legal reform initiatives. She started planning for a new initiative, one that would empower local communities to demand change from within. She knew that in order to see real transformation, the work had to go beyond the courtroom and into the communities where it could make the most impact. But as she worked on her plans, she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that her encounter with Judge Harris wasn't just a one-time event. It was the beginning of something bigger, a shift that could bring her face to face with the very system she was fighting to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, in the quiet of his chambers, Judge Harris was grappling with something he hadn't expected. Even the more he learned about Maria's work, the more it troubled him. How could he have missed the significance of her case? Was this just another person to dismiss, or was Maria Evans someone who could truly change the legal landscape for good? Judge Harris sat in his office late one evening, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He stared at the stack of papers in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to Maria Evans. He had made a decision in haste, assuming her case was just another minor infraction. Now, the more he learned about her work, the more uncomfortable he became with how easily he had dismissed her. He reached for the article again, the one a colleague had sent him just a few days after the court hearing. It was an in-depth feature about Maria, detailing her career, her innovative legal strategies, and the profound impact she had made on the communities she served. Maria's nonprofit wasn't just about offering legal aid. She had created an entirely new legal framework that sought to reduce recidivism and shift the focus from punishment to rehabilitation. Her approach was backed by years of research, collaboration with experts, and practical solutions that had already begun to bear fruit in several districts across the country. As Harris read, he felt a growing sense of regret. How had he failed to recognize the significance of her work? He had judged her based on one courtroom appearance, not understanding that this woman was reshaping the very system he had sworn to uphold. He could feel the sting of his own mistake, an error of judgment that went beyond the legal matter at hand. It was a personal failing that now weighed on him heavily. He put the article down and leaned back in his chair, trying to make sense of what to do next. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he had underestimated Maria, not just as an activist, but as a legal innovator. Her ideas were challenging the very foundation of the justice system in ways that could be revolutionary. He had only seen the surface, a woman standing in front of him with paperwork and legal jargon. What he had failed to see was the larger picture, the deep, systemic changes she was working toward. What bothered him even more was the realization that his ruling had been based not just on legal facts but on unconscious biases, something he had prided himself on never succumbing to. Maria Evans had been a name he had brushed aside without giving it enough thought. Now it seemed as though the world was waking up to her potential, and he was left to confront his own ignorance. The phone rang, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a colleague from the local law school, a professor with whom he had exchanged ideas over the years. "Arthur," the voice on the other end said, "have you heard about Maria Evans?" Harris exhaled slowly, recognizing the direction of the conversation. "I've been reading about her," he replied. "Her work is impressive." Impressive is an understatement, the professor said with enthusiasm. Her legal framework for rehabilitation is groundbreaking. It's already being implemented in several states, and it's showing real results. This isn't just some activist on a soapbox. Maria is an innovator, Arthur. We need to start paying attention. The conversation left Harris feeling unsettled, but also more determined. He knew that he couldn't ignore Maria any longer. She wasn't just a figure in the news, she was someone whose work had the potential to reshape the very legal system he had dedicated his life to. That night, after his colleague's words echoed in his mind, Harris made a decision. He would reach out to Maria Evans. He didn't know what he hoped to achieve by contacting her, but one thing was certain: he had to find out more. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to work together. The thought of it made him feel uneasy, but also strangely hopeful. Maria Evans wasn't just the woman he had found. She was someone who could teach him, challenge him, and perhaps help him see the law in an entirely new way. Let me know if you would like further adjustments or another continuation. Judge Harris couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had misjudged Maria Evans. His decision to fine her had been swift, but the realization that he had overlooked her groundbreaking work weighed heavily on him. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became with how easily he had dismissed her as just another activist. The legal world was full of people who challenged the system, but Maria was different. She was offering real solutions, not just protests or calls for change. Her methods were innovative, and he couldn't help but wonder how he had missed the significance of her work. Late one evening, after hours of sitting in his office, Harris finally picked up the phone. He dialed the number that had been provided to him in the article he read. His hand shook slightly as he waited for the call to connect. The sound of Maria's voice on the other end was calm, composed, and polite, just as he expected. But there was a hint of something else there, too. It was a strength, a quiet confidence that set her apart from anyone else he had ever met in his career. "Good evening, Ms. Evans. This is Judge Harris. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," he said, his voice tentative. Maria paused for a moment, as if processing the unexpected call. "No, not at all, Judge Harris," she replied. "How can I help you?" "I've been reading about your work," he said, clearing his throat. "And I've come to realize that I made a mistake during our court hearing. I didn't fully understand the impact of what you were doing. I'm sorry for that." The words felt awkward coming out of his mouth, but he knew they were necessary. He had spent years on the bench, dispensing judgments without ever second-guessing himself. But this time, something had changed. Maria had shown him that the law wasn't just about ruling based on the facts in front of him. It was about understanding the people behind those facts. Maria's voice softened as she spoke. "Judge Harris, I appreciate your honesty, but I don't want you to apologize for the fine. That was just one moment, one small part of a much larger picture. What I want is for the system to change, for people to be given the opportunity to rehabilitate instead of being punished endlessly." Harris was taken aback by her response. He had expected her to be angry or defensive, but instead, she sounded resolute. It was a reminder of why she had been so determined to create change in the first place. "I understand that now," Harris replied, "and I want to do more than just apologize. I want to help. I want to learn from you, Ms. Evans. I've spent years in this system, but I realize now that I have so much to learn from someone like you." Maria paused for a moment, considering his words. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, a note of curiosity in her voice. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, "but I think we could work together, find ways to implement some of your ideas within the system. I've seen firsthand how broken the system is. Maybe it's time for something different." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Harris wondered if he had overstepped. But then Maria spoke again, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "I think you're right, Judge Harris. The system is broken, and if you're willing to listen and learn, maybe we can make a real difference. But it will take more than just talk. It will take action." Harris felt a rush of hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like something could truly change, not just for Maria and her nonprofit, but for the system as a whole. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be resistance along the way. But for the first time, he truly believed that this was the beginning of something bigger than he had ever imagined. The conversation with Judge Harris had left Maria feeling both cautious and hopeful. She hadn't expected him to reach out with such humility, let alone express a genuine desire to collaborate. In the days that followed, she found herself reflecting on the phone call and what it might mean for the future of her work. For years, Maria had fought tirelessly against a system that often felt impenetrable, and yet here was a man in a position of power, someone who could be an ally. but the walls of doubt remained. Could she really trust him? Could someone like him, someone who had been a part of the very system she was working to change, become a true advocate for reform? Maria knew the answer wasn't simple. She had seen it before, well-meaning individuals who talked a big game about change, but when it came time to act, they hesitated or turned away. The system was designed to protect itself, and anyone trying to dismantle it would face fierce opposition. She had learned that the hard way. But something about the judge's sincerity had struck her. Maybe it wasn't about trust right away. It was about giving him the opportunity to prove that he was willing to fight for real change. And that, Maria realized, was something she could work with. In the weeks that followed, Harris and Maria began meeting regularly. Their first few meetings were awkward, the space between them filled with the weight of their respective roles. He was a judge, someone whose word could shape the fate of countless lives, while she was an activist, a legal innovator whose work sought to change the very systems he had upheld for years. They were on opposite sides of the spectrum, but the more they talked, the more they found common ground. Their shared commitment to justice was the foundation they built on. Maria walked Harris through her framework for legal reform, an approach that prioritized rehabilitation over punishment, restorative justice over incarceration, and second chances over a life sentence of social rejection. She explained how her model had already shown promise in several localities, how it was reducing recidivism rates and helping individuals reintegrate into society successfully. Harris was captivated, not just by the results, but by the humanity behind it all. For so long, he had viewed the law as a tool for punishment, a necessary instrument to maintain order. But Maria's ideas forced him to see it differently. He began to understand that justice wasn't about handing down harsh sentences. It was about giving people the chance to rebuild their lives. As the meetings continued, they began discussing practical steps for implementing Maria's ideas within the court system. Harris brought her into his courtroom, introducing her to his colleagues, explaining the innovative methods she had developed, and advocating for their integration into real cases. Some judges were resistant, skeptical that these new ideas could ever work on a larger scale. But Maria wasn't discouraged. She knew that any kind of change was going to be met with resistance. What mattered was that she had Harris, who was now an ally, willing to stand with her in the face of opposition. Maria was careful to keep her expectations in check, knowing that change never came quickly or easily, but the seeds had been planted. The more they worked together, the more she saw Harris becoming a different kind of judge, one who saw the people behind the cases, not just the violations they had committed. He wasn't perfect, and he would never be able to undo the damage caused by the system, but he was trying. And that, in Maria's eyes, was a step forward. Meanwhile, Maria continued her work with the communities she had always served. She hosted workshops for lawyers, social workers, and activists, spreading the word about her approach to justice. Slowly but surely, her framework gained momentum. But she knew that the true test would be when the system, as a whole, was willing to embrace her ideas. For the first time in a long time, Maria felt as though the pieces of her vision were starting to fall into place. The road ahead would still be long, and there would be obstacles along the way. But with allies like Harris, she felt the winds of change, blowing stronger than ever. The momentum was building. Maria could feel it in the air, a quiet but palpable shift as more legal professionals began to take notice of her work. The resistance she had faced in the early days was still there, but now it was tempered by something new: curiosity. People who had once dismissed her as an idealist or a disruptor were beginning to ask questions. Lawyers, social workers, and even judges were attending her workshops, eager to understand how her framework for rehabilitation could be implemented in real-world scenarios. The more they learned, the more they saw the potential for real change. But with the growing support came increasing scrutiny. Maria knew that her success wouldn't be without its challenges. The legal system was vast, and changing its foundation wasn't something that could happen overnight. She had to face pushback from powerful figures, entrenched in their belief that the punitive measures in place were necessary for maintaining order. And then there were those who saw her work as a threat to their control, a shift in power they weren't ready to let go of. But Maria was no stranger to opposition. She had been fighting for years, first against the injustices in her community and then against the legal system that seemed built to keep people like her down. She wasn't about to back down now, not when things were finally beginning to change. One afternoon, Maria received a call from an unexpected source. It was Judge Harris, and his tone was urgent. "Maria, we need to meet. There's something I need to show you." Maria agreed to meet him the following morning, but she couldn't help feeling a sense of unease. The last time she'd spoken to him, they had been discussing potential reforms in the courtroom, but now something in his voice suggested that this meeting might be about something bigger. When they met, Harris wasted no time. He slid a folder across the table to her. "Maria, I need you to look at this," he said. Inside the folder were several documents, including an internal memo and a series of case files. As she flipped through the papers, Maria's eyes widened in disbelief. The documents detailed a coordinated effort to undermine her work. Powerful figures within the judicial system were actively working to discredit her, spreading rumors and misrepresenting her ideas as radical and untested. It was a systematic campaign to stop her before her methods could take root. Maria felt a rush of anger and frustration. She had known that there would be opposition, but to see it laid out so clearly was another matter entirely. The memo outlined steps for discrediting her in public forums, including legal conferences and media interviews. It was clear that they saw her as a threat, someone whose success would shake the very foundation of the traditional justice system. Maria's mind raced as she processed the information. This wasn't just about one judge's opinion or a case she was working on anymore. This was about a concerted effort to crush everything she had worked for. Harris could see the frustration in her eyes, but he wasn't backing down. "They're scared, Maria. They know what you're doing is right, and they're going to try everything they can to stop it. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to stand by you." Maria nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. She knew the road ahead was going to be harder than she had imagined, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. Harris had become more than just an ally. He had become a partner in her fight for justice. Together, they would have to face down the forces trying to tear their work apart. But Maria wasn't worried. She had faced challenges before, and she had come out stronger each time. This time would be no different. As they talked through their options, Maria's resolve only hardened. The system might be fighting back, but so was she. She would not be silenced by a few threats or a handful of powerful individuals. Maria knew that the real change was always hard, but it was always worth it in the end. She was more determined than ever to see her vision through. For the people who needed her. For the people who had been forgotten by a system that wasn't built to serve them. The battle Maria faced now was unlike any she had encountered before. The legal establishment had long been resistant to change, but the documents Judge Harris had shown her revealed just how deep the opposition ran. Powerful individuals, those who had risen through the ranks by maintaining the status quo, were actively working to dismantle everything she had built. But Maria was not one to retreat in the face of adversity. She had never been one to back down, and this time was no different. If anything, this new challenge only fueled her determination to see her vision through. Maria and Harris spent the next few weeks planning their next steps carefully. They knew they couldn't take on the entire legal system at once. It would be a battle of attrition, one that would wear them down if they didn't approach it strategically. They decided to start small, focusing on one key issue, the prison-to-community pipeline. In their meetings, they began drafting a proposal that would allow individuals who were incarcerated for nonviolent offenses to have a second chance through rehabilitation programs that would provide real education, job training, and mental health support. The goal wasn't just to reduce recidivism, but to completely transform the way people were reintegrated into society. The proposal was ambitious, but Maria knew it was the right place to start. If they could successfully implement this program in just one district, it could become a model for the rest of the country. The benefits were undeniable, and she believed that once people saw the results, the system would have no choice but to adopt similar reforms. But as they prepared to take their proposal public, Maria's efforts were met with more resistance than she could have imagined. An anonymous smear campaign began to surface, painting her as someone who was soft on crime and out of touch with the realities of justice. The media, once eager to cover her work, now began to question her approach, framing it as naive and unrealistic. The pressure was mounting. The threats from powerful legal figures were no longer subtle. They had become blatant, and the attacks had started to reach her personal life. But Maria knew this was just another part of the process. If she had any hope of seeing change, she would have to endure this and more. Despite the mounting pressure, Maria remained focused. She spent hours poring over case studies, gathering data that would prove the effectiveness of her rehabilitation model. She enlisted the help of experts, including criminologists, social workers, and former inmates, all of whom supported her approach. Together, they built a compelling case for the efficacy of rehabilitation over punishment, and the time had come to present it to the public. When the proposal was finally ready for submission, Maria was ready to face the storm. She and Harris stood before the city council, presenting their case with clear, unwavering conviction. Maria spoke passionately, outlining the research and the lives that could be saved with this new approach. She talked about the long-term benefits, not just for individuals, but for entire communities, and how this shift could reduce crime, lower incarceration rates, and save millions of taxpayer dollars in the long run. Harris stood by her side, backing her with his decades of experience on the bench. His testimony lent credibility to her efforts, and for the first time, they seemed to be getting through. But just as the presentation reached its peak, the opposition hit back with full force. One council member, a staunch supporter of the old guard, stood up to challenge Maria's claims. "These ideas are impractical," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is not how the system works. We cannot afford to coddle criminals." Maria's heart raced as the council member's words echoed in the room. She could feel the tension rising, but she refused to be rattled. This was the moment she had been waiting for, her chance to make her case not just to a few people, but to an entire room of decision-makers. Taking a deep breath, she met the council member's gaze and responded, her voice steady and resolute. "The system hasn't been working," Maria said firmly. "It's been broken for years. If we continue down the same path, we'll only see more lives ruined, more families torn apart, and more people pushed into the cycle of incarceration. This isn't about being soft. It's about being smart. This is about real justice, the kind that changes lives." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, she saw something shift. The members of the council who had been silent began to whisper among themselves, and the opposition's confidence seemed to waver. Maria felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally breaking through. The room was still as the final moments of the council meeting unfolded. Maria's words had left an impression, and she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. What started as a hostile and skeptical gathering had slowly turned into a space filled with uncertainty and, perhaps, a glimmer of curiosity. The opponent's words had lost some of their sting. The reality of what Maria was proposing, of what Harris had backed, was now impossible to ignore. Change wasn't just an ideal anymore, it was a concrete possibility, and the council members were beginning to see it. The minutes stretched on as the council debated. Some members spoke out, questioning the feasibility of such a radical shift. Others voiced concerns about the costs and logistics, still clinging to the old ways. But something new had emerged in the room, an openness to hear more, to consider the data, the success stories, and the very real benefits that Maria and Harris had laid out. For the first time in years, a legal reform that prioritized humanity over punishment was at the forefront of the discussion. It was a hopeful moment, but Maria knew this battle was far from over. After what felt like hours, the council voted on the proposal. Maria and Harris stood side by side, their hearts pounding as the votes were tallied. One by one, the council members raised their hands, signaling their support. The tension was unbearable. Each vote a step closer to the future they had fought for. Finally, the vote was complete. The outcome was overwhelmingly in favor of Maria's proposal. The room erupted in a mixture of applause and disbelief. For a moment, Maria stood frozen, her mind racing to process what had just happened. It was a victory, but it was more than that. It was a validation of her work, of everything she had fought for over the years. It was proof that the system, even if slowly, could change, and she had helped push it in that direction. Harris turned to her, his face filled with a rare smile. "We did it," he said, his voice quiet but full of pride. Maria nodded, still trying to absorb the magnitude of the moment. But the relief and elation were short-lived. She knew that this was just the beginning. The hard work was still ahead. Now, the task was to implement the program on a larger scale, to prove that rehabilitation could be more effective than incarceration, to ensure that the policy didn't just exist on paper, but became a reality for the people who needed it most. As Maria left the council chambers, she was greeted by a sea of supporters, community members, activists, social workers, and even former inmates who had seen firsthand the power of rehabilitation. They cheered for her, for the system she was helping to create, for the people who would finally have a chance to rebuild their lives. It was a powerful moment, one Maria would never forget. But there was no time for celebration. The work was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Maria and Harris traveled across the state, meeting with local officials, law enforcement, and rehabilitation programs to put the new framework into action. The road ahead was challenging, but with each successful implementation, they saw the real-world impact of their efforts. Former prisoners were being given opportunities to work, to rebuild their lives, to heal. Communities that had been ravaged by mass incarceration were seeing the positive effects of rehabilitation rather than punishment. Maria had won a battle, but she knew the war for justice was far from over. The system would resist, as it always did, but now Maria had a vision, and she had an ally in Harris, someone who had once been part of the problem, but was now committed to being part of the solution. Together, they had shown the world that change was possible, and as Maria looked ahead, she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was long, but with each step forward, she was making history, and with each life she touched, the future became just a little bit brighter.